Well, I just want to say, you've braved this horrible weather. There was a cloudburst when I got out of my car. I hope you missed that. Thank you for coming this evening. Tonight, of course, is our second meeting that we've had regarding this, and I would like to introduce my colleagues. Gary Edwards, to my farthest left, Rachel Hundley, and both council members, and Vice Mayor Amy Harrington. So just, I hope you share all your thoughts. We need to hear a lot of that. So thank you for coming, and I'm glad we're somewhere dry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Agramonte. My name is Kathy Capriello, and I'm the city manager, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we're going to do tonight. The reason we're here is the city council is looking at cannabis regulations, and they have asked us to explore three types of cannabis licenses for the community, all relating to medicinal, looking at dispensaries, testing, and manufacturing. So this is the second town hall. The first town hall really was focused kind of on an industry overview and the law and some of the history in those pieces. This is going to be a little more focused on local issues and what local communities can do in terms of regulations. And some of that is mapping and distance, so we'll have a little exercise at the end where we're going to want your involvement. So what we hope that we all get a little better understanding on today is an understanding of kind of revenue sources and fees and what those opportunities are. Also talking about some of the implementation and administrative issues that are related to a city having cannabis. We'll talk about some challenges for public safety, finance audits, city oversight, and other implementation issues that need to be considered. And then we'll talk about some of the regulations. We've also we've asked a few folks to come today to provide kind of a little broader perspective as well. So I'd like to introduce the people you'll be hearing from. Jeff Collin, right here on my left, is with Muni Services. Jeff is a retired city manager, was in Beverly Hills and Santa Rosa, has a lot of experience with this, and is helping us as a consultant go through this process. Tim Ricard is the Cannabis Program Manager for Sonoma County with the Department of Economic Development. So he can provide to both the council, if they have questions, and the audience, talking a little bit about cannabis and economic development, and also just what's happening in the county. We've also invited Amy Jenkins, who's not with us currently. Amy is an advisor with Platinum Advisors. Amy was a representative and a lobbyist with the League of California Cities, so understands things from a city perspective, and now is a private lobbyist assisting cities, but then she also represents the cannabis industry. So she can give a little bit of a state perspective to us. She lives here in our own town, here in Sonoma. And then Sergeant Jeff Toney is a new sergeant to Sonoma Police Department, but has been with Sonoma County for about 20 years. And comes out of, has just recently worked in their high-profile crimes area, and so Jeff can speak a little bit about crime and cannabis and provide a Sonoma County perspective there. And then David Goodison, who is, where's David? There's David. Our esteemed planning director will be making part of the presentation in terms of some of the regulatory options as well. So again, this is a learning opportunity for us all to continue to learn more about cannabis and for us to hear from the community. This town hall a little different. I've asked the council to come sit up in front as well. That way, because we have a panelist, and if they have questions, then they can participate. Again, we're not looking for any direction from the council tonight. That will be coming back at a separate council meeting in May. So with that, I'd like to turn it to Jeff Collin, who will start us. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Kathy. It's good to be back in Sonoma again, and good to see some familiar faces out in the audience. I want to introduce one other person, Robert Hamoud. He's the Client Services Manager with Muni Services, and Robert's joining me this evening and is going to be helping me take minutes and record what happens tonight in the meeting. So thank you for being here, Robert. So as Kathy mentioned, we want to walk through Some slides here. I'll go fairly quickly or expeditiously through the slides, and they're going to cover some of the revenue sources and opportunities, fee structures, some of the administrative and implementation issues and challenges associated with cannabis, some of the risk factors with revenues and successful implementation of administration and oversight. And then I'm going to turn the presentation over to David to talk about land use regulations, buffer zones, and some of the mapping exercises. And then following that, we'll hear from our panelists that we've invited to join us this evening. Those have already been introduced, so I won't go back over those again. And this is a slide that we shared, I believe, at the last meeting as well. This is, shows the various taxes and fee structures that are often applied to the cannabis industry. The one on the left side of the slide, the pie chart, represents the state sales and use tax. And that's a base rate of 7.25%. And of that 7.25%, the city of Sonoma receives 1%, okay? Then the state, with Proposition 64, adopted state cannabis excise taxes. And that includes a 15% gross receipts sale on retail sales, plus cultivation taxes of $9.25 an ounce for flower, $2.75 an ounce for leaves, and a new category, $1.29 an ounce for freshly harvested cannabis. Now, in addition to those two things, cities can also establish their own excise tax, and they can apply that to any portion of the industry: cultivation, retail, manufacturing, testing, delivery, okay? And those have to be approved by the voters. And you can see examples anywhere from a high of 20%, city of Santa Barbara, down to 1%, and on various industries. Another example of that would be Santa Rosa. In addition to those taxes, cities and counties are allowed to collect administrative fees, or they're oftentimes called application fees. And these can only be charged to recover the costs of providing a service. And so these application license fees, renewal fees, or administrative fees usually are associated by a cost recovery study that establishes the kind of staff resources, equipment, and materials that are necessary to manage the permitting process, provide inspections, collect the taxes, and the like. And so those usually are associated with the review of applications to permit industries, and then an ongoing renewal fee, and sometimes an inspection or auditing process. Common fee structures for those taxes. Many of them are focused on gross receipts. Some of the advantage of that is that it's simple to understand. It's a percentage usually. It does require, or we recommend anyway, an audit because of the cash nature of the industry. It's difficult to sometimes verify the revenues and make sure they've been properly accounted for. Gross receipts can be impacted by price fluctuations, in other words, or supply fluctuations as well. And so those tax revenues can go up and down. It can be applied to all forms of commercial cannabis businesses. It's most commonly applied to retailers and wholesalers, and it provides a gauge of the level of business activities that are taking place. There are other kinds of taxes that are based on square footages. This can be applied also to all forms of the business, but you most frequently see it associated with cultivation. It's less complex. It's not impacted by price fluctuations because it's based on the size of the building or the cultivation area. And it doesn't represent the volume of business or sales activity or revenue that takes place within that square footage basis. So tax revenue considerations. A lot of things can impact tax revenues. Certainly the number of consumers and their consumption patterns, the number, type, and size of authorized commercial businesses within that taxing jurisdiction, and then the attractiveness of the retailer. Somebody that has a very attractive storefront, has a good presence inside the facility, that's welcoming to customers is going to do better than someone who doesn't. Non-retail ability to serve businesses located outside the city. So what this means is an example of a manufacturer or a testing lab in the case of Sonoma would want to make sure that they're accessible to businesses coming into the city, as well as, in the case of a manufacturer, shipping the product out for distribution. There's also competition from other licensed retailers as well as from the black market. And so you want to pay attention to what's taking place in the region around you, what the competition is like in the legal market and the taxation rates. And you need to make sure that you're also making sure you're not pricing your product out of the market and encouraging the black market to continue. And of course, the price of the raw material, the flower, the leaf, the trim, that also affects, can have impact on tax revenues. Another thing that we were asked to talk about is a development agreement. And these are more common in cases of residential development or industrial development or office development. There are agreements that are negotiated based on a size of a proposed facility, projected revenues and tax rates that are anticipated. And it's basically a contract between the local jurisdiction and the property owner. Or in the case of the cannabis industry, it could be a lessee that's operating the business. That provides certainty to the developer that the project will be isolated from changes in zoning, and it can also provide a guarantee on either stable tax rates or a fee, annual fee in lieu of application of tax rates. And in return for these things, the developer makes certain contributions back to benefit the community. And we can talk more detail or answer questions regarding those as we go along. This next slide is some of the examples of tax rates in the surrounding jurisdictions. So at the top, you'll see Cloverdale. And they're applying a 4.5% tax rate just across the board on all the different aspects of the industry. Cotati has a 3% tax on adult use cannabis retail, and then a 2 to 8% tax on cultivation or a square footage tax, and I'm not sure how they decide when to apply that. And you can see the other tax rates across the chart there. Santa Rosa, they only have a 3% tax on adult use, 2% on cultivation, 1% on distribution, 1% on manufacturing. And Sonoma County, 2% on dispensaries, $1 to $6.50 per square foot based on the type of cultivation, whether it's outdoor, indoor, mixed light, and different sizes. And then they have not adopted taxes yet on the other portions of the industry, with the exception of the 3% on manufacturing. And we'll go to the next one here. Another question or interesting piece of information is what's permitted or authorized surrounding Sonoma. And this data was surprisingly difficult for us to get. Not necessarily whether it's authorized, but the number of permits that are authorized and then how many have been issued. And so if people have different information, we'd be happy to receive that this evening. But City of Napa has not yet issued any storefront medicinal or storefront adult use. Cotati is authorized to issue 2, but has only issued 1 storefront medicinal and adult use, and that's the same dispensary, I believe. City of Santa Rosa has not established limits yet, and they have 3 of each, and I believe those are combined adult use and medicinal locations. Sebastopol is authorized up to 4, and they have, I believe, 2 total. And Sonoma County, Tim, I'm not sure whether this is correct or not. 5 medical. Okay, so we missed a couple of there. So, and as you will hear later, this is a dynamic and changing environment. Every few weeks or months, we see a change in a different jurisdiction, and you'll learn a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So what are some of the trends that are taking place, particularly with dispensaries? A lot of dispensaries started off as medicinal only because that was all that was permitted under state law for a number of years. And the trend is that these are beginning to transition to dual medicinal and adult use facilities. And that's pretty much happening across the state. And so we think that will be the trend for the future. There's lots of reasons for that. Economics is certainly one of those. And those businesses are concerned about the level of taxes in California. We have the highest taxes so far in the nation. And it's difficult for small businesses to survive in that environment. And I think if you talk to people in the industry, you will certainly hear that from them, that it's challenging to get started, it's expensive. One of the unique things about the cannabis industry is there are very few, if any, tax deductions available to the industry, particularly on the federal level, because of that Class 1 substance categorization. IRS does not allow you to take the normal business deductions. Sales information. The Marijuana Policy Group in Colorado has projected that a cultivation and manufacturing business would expect to have annual revenues someplace between $2 million and $15 million per year. That's a big range, and that's based primarily on the size of the facilities. There's a great variation in the size of those. And Berkeley estimates annual revenues of about $5 million per license that they've issued primarily to dispensaries. So just a couple of things. And then the chart there indicates the statewide cannabis sales projections from 3 different sources that we collected. So certainly a substantial industry. More information on sales tax revenue estimates. Average annual revenues from cultivation and manufacturing. This is from Washington State. Retailers, about 1.8 million per license per year. A 5% tax rate would generate about $90,000 per retailer. 10%, double that, $180,000. A manufacturer, about $790,000 per license per year. And you can see the tax projections at 5% and 10% listed there. And then the comparison, what's the cost of living adjustment from the Seattle area to Los Angeles or California jurisdictions, and it probably is going to mean that California will have higher averages and grosses than would occur in Washington. So one of the confusing things about California is its sales tax law, and it's based on a couple of different things. I talked about that base sales tax rate, and that's referred to the local portion as the Bradley-Burns portion. That's 1.25%. 1% goes to the city, and 0.25% goes to the county transportation funds. And those can be higher depending on if a city has passed a district tax. Sonoma has done that. It's 0.5%. And generally, retail sales of medical cannabis are exempt from those state and local taxes if the patient has a medical cannabis card, okay? If they don't, they'll be charged or should be charged the sales tax. So who gets the tax revenue depends on which portion of the tax we're talking about and where the sale takes place. In the place of that base rate, or the case of that base rate, the Bradley-Burns local tax and the 1% that comes to Sonoma, it's generally the place of sale is the primary business location. Okay, so if a business is located in Sonoma, within the city limits, the tax would go to the city of Sonoma. If it's located outside the city, in the county unincorporated area, the tax would go to the county. Now, people ask, what about deliveries? Okay? Same rule applies for the base rate. Okay? So if a delivery comes from a dispensary outside of the city, the revenue would go to the county. If the delivery occurs from a dispensary or business within the city, it goes to the city. The exception to that is the district tax rate, that half-cent tax. That will come to the city based on the destination of the sale. Okay? So even if that dispensary is in the county, if the delivery occurs to an address in the city should receive that 0.5% of the tax. Clear as mud, right? Okay. We talked about business regulatory fee structures. Those are those administrative fees, those application fees. They must be designed to recover the reasonable costs for issuing the licenses, permits, performing investigations, inspections, audits, and enforcing the regulations. They can be a one-time fee. They can also be based on annual costs of administering the system. And they can also be tiered or phased to allow participation by different levels of operators. So what we're trying to get down to is what can Sonoma anticipate in terms of possible revenues? And that's what this chart hopefully will show. So again, we're going back to the marijuana policy group out of Colorado and those annual average sales per square foot for a cannabis dispensary or retail business. And those range from $800 to $1,000 a square foot. And the average, we're taking an average of $900 a square foot. And then we've arbitrarily set some dispensary sizes. We've set a small dispensary that's 1,000 square feet or less, medium from 1,000 to 2,000 square feet, large over 2,000 square feet. And then we've applied the half-cent district tax, the 1% Bradley Burns sales tax, and then arbitrarily selected a 4% excise tax and applied that as an illustration, and then also given another illustration of what a 10% excise tax would generate. So as an example, a medium-sized dispensary, if you collected the half-cent, the 1%, and the 4% tax, you'd generate close to $100,000 a year in tax revenue for the city. Okay. All of these things go to illustrate the overall system of administration for cannabis. And this involves both administrative activities and compliance activities. And you can see all of those things listed in the circles represented here. It's education, audits, resource and cost analysis, monitoring, evaluation and selection process to determine who gets the permits and is allowed to do business in a community, ordinance review and development, and then the revenue analysis and collection piece. One of the other things we talked about last time was some of the challenges with the industry because of the cash nature of the industry, because banking services are difficult for the industry to get and maintain. And so in many cases, they do almost 100% of their business with cash. And that means, you need to prepare for that. Some of the solutions possibly that are out there are bank or credit unions. Many of the businesses choose not to tell them that they're cannabis industries and just go in and apply for bank accounts. And for a while, that's successful. But changing oftentimes creates substantial challenges when they find out and close the accounts. Many of the industries use armored cars, regular cash pickups. They have to invest in safes, all those kinds of things. Some use on-site ATMs as a way of allowing a customer to withdraw cash at the site and not have to carry it in themselves. There's money services, money orders, et cetera. And then there is some effort on the development of third-party pay systems such as PayPal or kind of internet-based payment cards where you purchase the card in advance and then come into the dispensary or the retail sales outlet and use a card. So considerations for a city. You want to make sure that you're protecting the safety of both the cannabis business and the government employees who will be collecting tax and application and permit fees. You want to make sure that it's easily accessible. And you want to spread out those payments so that not everybody's coming in on the same day every quarter to make their payments. You need to be prepared to handle large dollar volumes and multiple accounts easily. And you want to make sure that you minimize the risk and loss of revenue receiving agencies. And we have a whole bunch of recommendations about measures to incorporate on this next slide for local governments. Certainly security is important, appropriate staff coverage, limiting who has access to the cash in the facilities where it's received. We recommend that a video system be installed that covers where that cash will be counted and recorded and stored. Documentation and verification and separation of duties for the accounting of the cash. And then oftentimes the staff who handle the cash also have safety and health concerns. They're going to want to make sure they have gloves, in some cases masks, because oftentimes the cash can be have an odor or residue associated with it from those who handle the cannabis materials. Adequate ventilation plans, cleaning supplies, and rotating staff through so that they don't have long periods of exposure. Another concern with cannabis is that we're still finding out more about THC, the active ingredient in cannabis. It stays for a long time in the body. It's absorbed in the fatty cells, and it's often detectable for as long as 30 days after a frequent user discontinues use. And that makes driving under the influence of the drug difficult to establish an intoxication level. And right now there is no uniform per se limit like there is with alcohol. There's not a percentage of blood alcohol like limit that's been established for THC. And it's also difficult to have a field test that can determine the level that's present in the bloodstream. Another characteristic are the vapor cartridges. They don't have that same distinct odor that you do from smoking the product. And so it's much more difficult to detect in a public setting. And we hear stories about it being consumed in school bathrooms, in public walkways, public parks. Much more difficult to determine whether someone's consuming a cannabis-related vapor product or a tobacco-related vapor product. Edibles are another part of the industry. They have longer lasting effects, and they also take longer to have an effect. So somebody can ingest an edible, and it can take 45 minutes to an hour for someone to feel the impact of the product that they consumed. And so sometimes what happens is somebody says, I'm not feeling anything, I'm going to eat another one of these things. And before they start feeling things, and it's too late, they've consumed perhaps more than they would have or should have. And so the rule is start low and go slow with edibles. Smoking or vaping takes effect much faster. The THC and the CBD's uptake occurs quickly, but it also wears off or diminishes more quickly. And certainly the health damage from the particulate matter in smoke, as well as the vaping cartridge, is a subject of further research and a concern. We talked a little bit about the driving impaired or DUIDs. There's lots of studies out there and anecdotal information about whether it's the same as alcohol, whether it's worse than alcohol, whether it's better than alcohol. I will just say at this point, it's illegal to drive under the influence of a drug or exceed the alcohol limit, and that's the guideline that you should pay attention to. The one positive thing that I think there's some agreement upon is that cannabis products provide an alternative to the use of opioid painkillers, and that's a positive thing for many patients who have chronic pain. Okay, city resources needed for administrative oversight. These are some of the things, the functions that will be needed, and we recommend to many of our city and county clients, certainly planning and permitting resources, resources for inspections, things like building and safety inspections, fire and hazardous material inspections, public health, tax and compliance audits, prevention programs, education programs, public relations and media, data collection. One of the things is that there's a lot of interest from the media about what's happening with communities that have permitted legal cannabis, and they're going to want to know, have you had crime? What kind of revenues are you receiving? Have you had any citizen complaints? And so keeping track of those things is important. And be prepared to evaluate the existing, the workload on existing city staff and whether you have capacity to absorb these additional tasks with existing staff. There are low-cost models available for administering cannabis industries and collection of taxes. Certainly that has less use of administrative resources and staff resources than a more intense program. It requires less business coordination and oversight, less dispensary decoy operations or sting operations from a public safety department, less cost and effort on training and inspectors. However, it also can lead to greater tax avoidance or evasion, may lead to more youth sales or shoulder tap types of transactions where they have an adult go into a dispensary or adult use sales location and then bring the product out. There could be more health, safety, environmental, or labor violations without the enforcement. So the question for Sonoma is, do you have the team you'll need? Because bottom line, you want to make sure that you have the team to, first of all, get the correct permittees and license holders in your community who are going to be responsible business people and that are going to, enhance the quality of life in your community. So at this point, let me turn it over to David, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the zoning considerations and start with an overview on buffer zone requirements and some of the local options. David?
Thanks very much. As we discussed at the last workshop, and for those of you who attended that, some of this may be a little bit redundant, there's already, of course, an extensive framework of state laws that regulate commercial cannabis activities. And that is helpful because it narrows down, in many instances, the range of issues that a local government really needs to spend its time dealing with, because there are all kinds of licensing requirements imposed at the state level associated with these different activities that may or may not be authorized at the local level. With respect to some of the basic requirements of the law, if a community does decide to authorize dispensaries within its jurisdiction, under state law, that use can't be located closer than 600 feet from a school, from a school. But it's a little bit tricky from there in that while there's in essence, a default in state law that says, absent other local standards, a 600-foot separation is also required for youth-serving facilities. But what that means is that it's a local option. The local government can choose to have a lesser or greater buffer or separation requirement from a youth-serving facility. But the requirement associated with schools is absolute. In terms of local zoning options, commercial cannabis activities are just that. They are a commercial activity. And so the only zoning districts in which they would normally be allowed within Sonoma would be the commercial zoning districts, of which we have two, the Gateway Commercial Zone and the Standard Commercial Zone, and also the Mixed Use Zone. And so a decision point in that regard, if dispensaries or other commercial activities were allowed in Sonoma, is what zoning designations are appropriate for that use. Would they be authorized within both the commercial and the mixed use zone, or allowed only in the commercial zoning districts? Another zoning consideration that has been raised over the course of these different discussions is whether or not if dispensaries and other cannabis activities are allowed, should they be allowed in the plaza? There are different kinds of uses that aren't allowed in the plaza. For example, large-scale formula restaurants are not allowed in the plaza. If there was a similar community concern about dispensaries for whatever reason, then that is a local option that's available. Other kinds of permit types and limitations, issues that need to be addressed as this discussion moves forward to the City Council will be the permitting requirement. So for example, typically when we look at a use that has the potential to create compatibility issues, a use permit review is required, and that's a permit that is reviewed and approved by the Planning Commission. And it allows the Planning Commission to base its decision on the specific circumstances of the project and on the circumstances of its surroundings. But once a use permit is issued, it runs with the land. And that has been a concern with respect not only to dispensaries, for example, but other kinds of activities where the jurisdiction might prefer to have that level of oversight but not establish a permit that runs with the land, because it can be very difficult to revoke such a permit if it is determined that even if it is determined that there are issues associated with the operation of the use that are making it less compatible than might have been foreseen. So some communities are going with a dispensary license that still allows for a discretionary review process, but as a license, it's restricted to the operator of the dispensary. It's not automatically transferred upon change of ownership. And there are many more options for the local jurisdiction to revoke the license if it is found that there are issues with the operation of the business. In many smaller communities that have gone down this road, there are limitations on the number of dispensaries allowed in the community. So, for example, Cotati has a limit on the number of dispensaries that it allows within its city limits. Sonoma faces that decision as well. If the council decides to authorize dispensaries, that's going to be a key question. Is there going to be a numerical limit? And if there is a numerical limit, what selection process would be used to evaluate and choose between potential competing applications? And then there are more standard kinds of local regulations that would need to be discussed, such as hours of operations and other operating restrictions. Now, we have many examples within the nearby area, again, including Cotati, Sebastopol, and Santa Rosa, to draw from and learn from. So it's not as though this is entirely new ground, although it is a relatively new area. There are other communities that have gone forward and developed different kinds of regulations in this regard and have been implementing them for some time. And we can certainly learn from those communities, and we're doing that even now. But the decisions that are made, if commercial cannabis activities are allowed within the city limits, those are local decisions, and they're going to be made by our local decision makers, our city council, and they're going to be based on local input from the residents of Sonoma and Sonoma Valley. But that said, in terms of some of these local examples, this is a slide that depicts different kinds of buffer zones that different jurisdictions have employed. Cotati, Napa, Santa Rosa. In Cotati, as shown on this slide, dispensaries are only allowed in commercial zoning districts. They can't be in the downtown district, and there's a 500-foot buffer requirement from youth-oriented facilities and other smoke shops. Napa, they're looking at 1,000-foot separation. Santa Rosa, 600 feet from other cannabis retail uses or from the K-12 school, which is the minimum state requirement. And then Sebastopol, dispensaries are allowed in commercial or industrial areas, not in residential areas. They have some visibility requirements and also a buffer requirement associated with youth-oriented facilities. This slide shows what the minimum buffer zone requirement looks like. So if dispensaries were allowed within the city of Sonoma, these buffer zones would be required under state law. So this is a 600-foot school buffer zone. Now, the city, if dispensaries were allowed, could just leave it at that, but this would be the minimum state-mandated requirement. This next slide shows different kinds of buffer zone options that the community can consider in addition to the state minimums. So this slide shows a variety of different kinds of activities that are sometimes regulated and sometimes not by other communities, including daycare centers, preschool, similar kinds of youth-oriented facilities such as the Boys and Girls Club, the Teen Center. And this slide shows for those different kinds of facilities a 600-foot buffer zone and a 300-foot buffer zone. So it's not, and this is again intended to just show the wide range of options that's available. We didn't choose to provide a slide that shows a residential buffer zone. Now, in some larger communities, there's a buffer zone from any nearby residentially zoned property or residence. And in fact, that's true in the county of Sonoma. And that can work in a county or in a larger city. But in Sonoma, where so much of the community has a residential zoning designation, that kind of buffer zone simply would not work as a practical matter, in that it would result in basically a de facto prohibition on dispensaries. And to the extent that the community is going to be making a decision about whether or not to allow these activities, it should be that. It should be a true decision about whether or not the facilities are going to be allowed, and if so, where, rather than developing a regulatory framework that is onerous to the point of not being workable. So those are the kinds of issues that the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council will have to address, assuming under the option of the council choosing to allow dispensaries and other commercial cannabis activities within city limits. We did want to, just as more of a news item, bring to your attention a dispensary application that's been made at the corner of Arnold Drive and Fremont Drive. That's in the vicinity of the Vineyard Hotel. This is for a 5,000 square foot dispensary with delivery service. And there is another use permit application pending for a site at the corner of Madrone Road and Arnold Drive as well. Obviously, these are both in the unincorporated area. The county has its own rules and regulations concerning dispensaries and other commercial cannabis activities. So regardless of what decisions are made within the city of Sonoma, those county regulations have their own allowances and permitting processes that are being exercised. And we certainly don't know what the outcome will be of these use permit applications, but we did just, as the context of this workshop, wanted to make them known as part of the information. So at this point, I'm not sure if we're doing the mapping exercise or moving on to the panel. All right, so with that, I'm done.
Thank you, David. So at this point, I'd like to invite our panelists to join us up here at the front of the table. And it looks like Amy's been able to join us. Welcome. So we have three panelists that are going to be making brief comments or presentations. And let me pull up the first one here. So our first speaker is going to be Tim Ricard with the Sonoma County Economic Development Board. And Tim, if you'd want to come up.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Let me just get this on presentation mode. There we go. Well, as Jeff said, my name is Tim Ricard. I work with the County of Sonoma. My background is in land use planning, but most recently I've been working for the Sonoma County Economic Development Board. And back in June, I was asked to fill the role as Cannabis Program Manager. And any of you that saw the front page of the Press Democrat this morning understand that it's a very easy job. The cannabis market, as Jeff noted, it is very large here in California with an estimated $7 billion in legal sales each year. However, that does not account for a very large black market. It's estimated that 70% of the cannabis grown in California leaves the state and is consumed elsewhere. So the vast majority of cannabis grown here is not consumed here. We are a cannabis exporting state, even though that it is not legal. So talking about the Sonoma County Cannabis Program, we often use this analogy that it's building the airplane as we're flying it. And we use that in part because we are trying to permit a long-time industry that has been operating through a legal framework from Proposition 215 for a number of years. And we're trying to bring them into the new model, which is a commercial business model. We are also building the airplane as we're flying it because we drafted regulations that allowed the industry to transition to the regulated market, but we're also constantly looking at ways to revise our ordinance, and that's what the meeting yesterday was about. So taking a step back, 2016, we spent the year doing a lot of public outreach, meeting with people, had a lot of town halls just like this, all throughout the county in order to develop our ordinances. It took a full year, and those ordinances were adopted on December 20th, 2016. 2017 was really about the first steps of implementation. Before we could start issuing or accepting permits, we had to build out a wide variety of things. We had to hire staff, we had to build a tax collection system, we had to build out our code enforcement division, we had to figure out ways that all these departments could communicate with each other, we had to build a website, et cetera. And in 2018, we are now 9 months into implementing and accepting permits, and we are looking at the lessons we've learned and taking public feedback on ways to make our ordinance better. So as I mentioned, the ordinance implementation has been a Herculean task. There was also a large aspect where we had to educate the cultivation community and long existing industry on what the regulatory process was. These are people that have operated, whether legally or illegally, outside of a county regulatory process for many years. So we put together a workshop series that we called Dirt to Dispensary, and we held those at the Glazer Center in Santa Rosa, and many of them had over 300 people attend. We covered topics such as cultivation, best management practices for water and wastewater, pesticide use. We have had 2 on security, really covered a breadth of topics. We also created a website and a hotline that are quite busy. We average over 100 calls and emails a week through this process. So we try and put as many of the resources up on the website as possible because there is a insatiable demand for this information and for questions about how to move through the process. As far as taxes, the county passed Measure A, and that was approved with 71%. That was, I believe, in May 2017. Our cultivation taxes are based on a square footage basis. And that's for outdoor, indoor, and mixed light. They range from $1 per square foot for a small outdoor grower to $11.25 per square foot for a very large indoor grower. For the supply chain, as Jeff mentioned, we use a gross receipts tax that is 2% for dispensaries and 3% for manufacturers. So a lot of people are curious, is this a big moneymaker for the county? The short answer for that is no. So far, for the first 2 quarters, we've brought in $1.6 million in tax revenue. We're expecting about a total of $2.5 million in revenue this year. That will cover our costs and provide a small fund balance, but it's well below our projected revenue estimates. In addition, in looking forward into future years, much of this tax was collected through businesses that were allowed to operate through our penalty relief program, which allows pre-existing operators to continue operating while they go through the permit process or stop operating if they're on permit ineligible properties. So our tax revenue is expected to go down next year as many of those businesses will not make it through the permitting system or will just simply choose to close their doors. So when I talk of implementation, I think we have a kind of a 2-step approach. We have the carrot and the stick. A couple of these carrots I already mentioned, but the transition period. The Board of Supervisors voted to outlaw cannabis on zoning districts that are ag residential and rural residential. That is where a large percentage, some estimate about 70% of the existing cultivation businesses were located. We adopted those rules on December 20th, 2016, and we didn't accept permits until July 5th, 2017. So we did not want to make those businesses that had long operated in our community illegal overnight. So we allowed those businesses to transition till January 1st, 2018 to either cease or find a permit-eligible location. Those that were on a permit-eligible location could register for a penalty relief program that, as I mentioned before, allows them to continue operating while they put together their permit application and while their permit application is being reviewed and either approved or denied. I already touched on the cannabis hotline, and finally, one thing we did was stagger our tax program because many outdoor cultivators don't bring in any revenue in Q1, so we allowed them to pay their full year's tax through quarters 2, 3, and 4. So where are we? We have accepted 152 applications. However, only 33 of those are complete, meaning we can only currently process 33 applications. We have approved 5, 3 of those for cultivation, 1 for distribution, and 1 for manufacturing. As I mentioned, $1.6 million in tax revenue, and we have 551 code enforcement cases. As this product was legalized, the enforcement of it shifted from the Sheriff's Department to our Code Enforcement Division. So we had to ramp up our Code Enforcement Division and create a lot of more powerful tools for that division, including land use civil penalties that can go up to $50,000 a day and the ability to lien property in order to collect some of those fees. So a little further breakdown of our applications. We have 1 testing lab, 3 dispensary applications. We have 5 existing and a cap of 9. So we're getting towards the top of our cap if all 3 of those were to be approved. 7 distribution facilities, 10 manufacturing facilities, and as you can see, the vast majority are cultivation. We have a much different landscape than the city of Sonoma. We have a lot of agricultural land out there. Of that cultivation, the majority of it is outdoor, and we're one of a handful of counties in California that allow outdoor cultivation. And mixed light, 8.23 acres. Mixed light is essentially what you consider greenhouse. It's mixed light because it not only has a greenhouse aspect to it, but it usually has supplemental lighting, and more importantly, the ability to block out the light, to do light deprivation, and then of course, indoor cultivation. Here in Sonoma Valley, we have 3 cultivation applications and 1 dispensary application on Fremont. And that concludes my presentation. I don't think we're taking questions now. We're moving through to the rest of the panel, correct? Right. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I think our next 2 panelists are going to speak from the table here. So I think Amy will go with you next, and then with Jeff.
Okay, great. Well, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to sit here. So hopefully you can all hear me. I come in, and forgive me for being a little late, I come in from a very different perspective. I think there might be a little value in telling you kind of how I got here. So I was born and raised in Sonoma. This is still my community where I live, but I'm actually a lobbyist in Sacramento. I am 23 years in, working in the state capitol. And I started in local government. I was a local government advocate for 8.5 years. And interestingly enough, I represented a lot of cities, including cities in the Emerald Triangle area back in 2005. And they came to me and they said, we don't know what to do with cannabis. And we need clarity. And I remember going to the league and saying, which is the State Association for Cities, and saying, you know, there's a problem here. We don't know how to regulate cannabis. We don't understand it. There's a disconnect between state and federal. And I remember being laughed out of the room as a lobbyist in front of all my colleagues and before this board of city representatives, and they said, look, that's an Emerald Triangle problem. It's not a California problem. So fast forward, the league came to me in 2014 and said, we want to develop a state regulatory framework. And I share all this with you because I went from being a local government advocate and lobbyist. I now actually represent the California Cannabis Industry Association in Sacramento. We have about 400 members, but most of these entities have multiple companies under their holding company umbrella. So they're cultivators, they're manufacturers, they're dispensary operators, they're testing labs. So in total, it's about 10,000 employees. And so I've been advocating for them for the last 4 years and working with different local governments throughout the state. So I'm really happy to be home today, throughout the state to better educate and inform people on the state cannabis laws and how to apply things locally. And so I deal with law enforcement, local government, many different individuals. I'm actually late today because I was stuck in negotiations in a committee in Sacramento talking about this very subject. So again, it's really a pleasure to be here today, and again, back in my community talking about something that is now near and dear to my heart. So thank you, Jeff, for inviting me in the council. I'll start a little bit, that's my story. So I'll start a little bit in talking about stats, and I come from less from a practitioner point of view, but more from an advocacy point of view. But I think it's important for you to understand what's happening in Sacramento. And there were some comments about it earlier. So first, statistically now, we have 29 states that are regulating. We have 8 that have authorized adult use, including California. We're a little late to the party, even though we were one of the first to actually regulate and approve medicinal cannabis. In terms of industry by the numbers, it's about a $6.7 billion industry in North America. In the United States, that includes Canada. In the United States, it's about 87% of that market. So it's a very significant market, and of that, California is about 27%. So it's a very, very very robust industry and really centered in the state of California. In terms of support for cannabis, despite some of the real concerns locally, general perception is when you do a poll, it's actually polling about 80%, at least from the medical side, and that actually spans across party affiliation. In fact, last year there was a poll that said Republicans who were traditionally non-cannabis proponents are actually now polling higher, and well over 50% are supporting it, primarily for medical use. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic from, general polling statewide perspective, but that still, again, doesn't speak to all of the challenges that you are grappling with as a community and as your local leaders are grappling with. But it's something to be mindful of. Attitudes are changing. And I'll tell you anecdotally, it used to be 4 years ago when I first started talking about this issue from the advocacy side, I couldn't get in a room with very many elected officials. Today, there are 55 cannabis bills working their way through the legislature, and it is one of the most engaging and hot topics being debated. And that poses challenges too, because as cities are trying to grapple with how do we regulate, what sort of aspects of the industry are we willing to accept in our community, the laws are continuing to change. And so I really commend the council and staff for really trying to focus on this, but I will be very, I'll be very honest with you, the laws and regulations are changing almost daily. So that's, a very, very difficult challenge. I did hear Jeff talk about some of the broader challenges at the federal level, so I won't touch on those. But let me just say, from a community perspective, the industry is changing. It's not the industry from the 60s. Most of my clients and most of the operators that I am working with are regular business business folks just like everybody else. You would be very, very surprised when you come to a conference. Most of these are young entrepreneurs, and in some cases it's their second or third business. They are very invested in their community, most of them very significantly because they have to be taken seriously as an industry. So that is changing quite significantly. So what I will often tell people who are interested in this subject or are trying to assess whether this is something that will be acceptable in their communities, I strongly advise tours. And 90% of the time, people walk out of a dispensary or a manufacturing facility or a testing lab, and there's really no distinction, really, except for maybe the smell. Candidly, that's really the only distinction. So, but these are generally normal businesses, like any other business in your community. And the thing I would also say too is that for those communities that don't choose to regulate, and I respect local control immensely, having worked in the local government world for so long, and that's a fundamental tenet and premise of this framework is local control. But what I would say is for those communities that don't regulate, you have a very active, I can assure you, a very active cannabis community. You will have delivery operators unregulated. I am no doubt there is manufacturing of some sort going on in this community. We certainly know that there is cultivation. And so one of the benefits of exploring what works in your community is recognizing that when you do begin to regulate or you contemplate a regulatory framework, the first thing I will say is it becomes a much more transparent industry. The industry will come out. The industry wants to come out. They want, again, to be a part of the community. So, for those that ban, it's happening in your community, irrespective. So let me talk a little bit about, briefly, the benefits of regulating. And again, there's 25 different licenses, so we won't get into that, but there's cultivation, manufacturing, testing, retail, distribution, to name a few. But really, the opportunities as it relates to regulating, as and I already touched on one, is transparency. You know who is actually, engaging in these business opportunities, and it gives an opportunity for your local leaders and the city staff to better regulate, or county staff in some cases. So transparency is really, really essential, and I think important for any community. You want to know who your actors are, who your businesses are. The other thing I'll talk about is the safety of consumer products, and we can talk about public safety as well, but the products themselves. So communities that regulate, the state has established the most ambitious guidelines as it relates to consumer product safety. So packaging and labeling standards, there are now ingredient labels. Every product has to be tested. All of those things are now required under the new framework. And in fact, they are more, the packaging and labeling and testing requirements are the most ambitious than any other state that is regulating commercial cannabis. So when you are authorizing, again, those products come to light and you can see them and you know that what you're getting is a quality product that has met all of the rigorous testing requirements. So I think that's really important. Track and trace. So track and trace is something, we also refer to it as seed to sale. But in regulated communities, licensed cannabis operators are required by law, effective July 1 roughly, although that's a moving target, are required to adhere to what's called a track and trace protocol. And this is also important from a law enforcement perspective, and law enforcement lobbied very, very aggressively in Sacramento on track and trace, because what it means is when you have a product that has a barcode, law enforcement can actually access and identify where it came from, who manufactured it. It tracks from seed to sale. So regulated products are now going to be subject to a track and trace requirement. I used to spend a lot of time on a panel with a former law enforcement officer who talked a lot about this. And I think track and trace is particularly important in communities that are concerned about access, child access to these products. And what the law enforcement officer typically said in his presentation is, in regulated communities, again, if a child is in possession, you're going to know where that product came from. In the case of today, in most instances when minors are in possession of this product, there is no mechanism for determining where it was purchased or how it was obtained. So track and trace is a significant benefit. You also read a lot about illegal grows. Again, in the regulated framework, it has some of the most rigorous environmental standards. I mean, this is California, that's what we do, but some of the most rigorous environmental standards. And so all licensed operators are required to adhere to those. Taxation. Taxation is also a key component. As a local entity, a local government, you are authorized to tax this product. In addition, there are state taxes that took effect January 1. There's a little bit of there's a few challenges with the taxation framework, but the taxation piece is also essential. So if there are things that you want to fund as a local community, you can dedicate those tax revenues for that purpose. One of the cities I've worked with, actually two cities in particular that I would highlight, would be Sacramento, which has imposed a tax and is investing very, very heavily in youth access, intervention, prevention types of activities. The same with the city of Santa Ana in Orange County. Orange County is very focused on, again, youth after-school programming. So about 30% of those revenues are being dedicated for that purpose. The industry is welcoming of these tax frameworks as well, because again, I think the key to recognize is that most of these businesses want to be in the light, they want to be regulated, and they want to be able to acknowledge what they're doing and how they want to benefit the community. A couple other things I'll just note, consistent with and kind of in comment to some of the things Jeff talked about earlier. The state taxation also is going to provide resources to local government to aid in public safety. So for communities that do intend to regulate, there will be grant monies available for enforcement of illicit operations. So I think that's important. DUI impairment was also discussed. There is going to be, and has actually been since last year, significant investment in DUI impairment to the tune of about $3 million, I think, last year, or excuse me, in this current budget year, and then more will be appropriated ongoing to really try to begin measuring those impairment thresholds. So those are some of the the opportunities that exist, at least from a higher level. I would note too, youth access. There's a 60% pot of money that's going to be going to, again, youth access programs, and there's a lot of debate about how that investment will be made, whether it'll be dedicated to schools and mental health. But the key is the industry is shifting. I think the state legislature is recognizing some of the changes, and I think what you're going to begin to see are more policies geared towards treating these operators like the businesses they want to be. So again, I'm a little bit different perspective in the room, but I look forward to your questions tonight.
Thank you, Amy. And now let's turn it over to Sergeant Tony for the law enforcement perspective.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So, a little bit of background on myself. As Kathy mentioned, I've been with the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office for approximately 20 years through various facets, from the detention division to patrol. And most recently, prior to being promoted, I worked in our Violent Crimes Investigations Bureau, which generically means robbery homicide. So the Sheriff's Office and the Sonoma Police Department stance is our number one concern is public safety. If an incident is brought to the attention of the Sheriff's Office, Sonoma Police Department, that arises to the level of a public safety concern, then we're going to get involved in it. Excuse me. Obviously, with the legalization of marijuana in California, we understand that city code enforcement is responsible for permitting, regulating, and code enforcement. Sheriff's Office has been currently compiling stats of marijuana-related violent crimes, and we're identifying trends locally, nationally, and internationally. And I'm going to talk about statistics with specific regard to homicides. It was difficult to mine some of the statistics with regard to marijuana, meaning that when our analysts went in and tried to bring up statistics for violent crimes, robberies, home invasions, it's somewhat skewed because when you use the word marijuana, it might be involved in a domestic violence incident. So what we did was we took homicides, murders specifically, and went back 3 years, and I'll talk about those stats. Marijuana cultivation, growing, selling is inherent to violent crimes. Like I said, prior to being promoted, I worked in the violent crimes unit for 4.5 years. I probably investigated myself or was the lead on approximately 20 home invasion robberies. And that's just me. There are 4 other members or detectives in the unit itself. So if you take those numbers and you spread them over the other 4 detectives, you can approximate those numbers. And again, I don't have those stats. I'm going to specifically talk about homicides. The most recent, if you've read the paper and been involved in marijuana-related incidents and violent crimes, the most recent marijuana-related violent crime involved the victimizing of children and the elderly, as well as those involved in the marijuana business, regardless if the business is legal or illegal. Although no one should be victimized, especially in a violent manner, the recent trends have shown no boundaries. In our current climate, growers and suppliers generally accept the potential of an inherent risk of being victimized, regardless if you're permitted or not, legal or illegal. Recently, others not involved in growing and supplying have also fallen victim to the current violent crimes. This generally occurs when criminals have misinformation on specific locations. And what we're seeing is within the county itself, we're seeing an uptick, a trend where you get a lot of folks from the East Coast coming over to California and committing these violent crimes, these robberies, these homicides, where they're stealing marijuana and taking it back to the East Coast where its value is 2 to 3 times higher than what it is in California. And also at the same time, their intelligence gathering, I guess, if you will, from these suspects isn't always accurate. So the public is at risk if you're living next door to someone who is growing marijuana. You could potentially be targeted by someone who is trying to steal your marijuana just because they have the wrong information or the wrong house. We've seen that several times as well. We need to identify and accept that there's an inherent risk in the current climate of business business in growing and supplying of marijuana, regardless if its purpose is considered legal or illegal, permitted or not permitted, grower or supplier. The monetary gain by criminals to illegally steal or rob people of this product and the money involved outweighs the risk of being caught. And then we recognize that the criminal element of increased violence continues to gain momentum in the number of cases we receive information on and those we are currently investigating. And we also have to consider that, you know, in this line of business, there's a lot of these incidents that are not being reported, just for fear of exposing themselves to the potential illegal aspect of it as well. So. What the Sheriff's Office did, the crime analysis analyst went back to 2016 through 2018. And in 2016, there were 3 murders. 3 of those murders were marijuana related. 1 was a double homicide, which amounted to 100% of the homicides in 2016, and this is a county jurisdiction. In 2017, there were 5 murdered. 2 of those 5 were marijuana related. 1 was a double homicide, which made up 40% of the homicide rate for that year. And then in 2018, currently, we have 1 homicide, 1 murder, which is marijuana related. The stat doesn't include the recent attempt murder on the same day with the same suspects where the victim survived his gunshot wound. So from 2016 to March of 2018, 9 murders occurred, for which 6 are marijuana related, which puts us in an area of 66.6% of all murders in the county jurisdiction being marijuana related. So what the Sheriff's Office also did is kind of broke down, if you will, the cost in investigating these homicides. And we developed a 5-phase approach to calculate what it costs the Sheriff's Office to work a marijuana-related case from start to finish. This is an approximate value based on a marijuana-related triple homicide, if you guys remember, back in 2013 that occurred in Forestville. The actual cost will vary greatly from one case to the next, obviously. So the 5 phases that are recognized are the initial response. This is the dispatch call for service that sends the deputies out to initially to investigate the report. The initial response includes 911 call to dispatch. Dispatch sends deputies to the scene, broadcast the additional information. When the deputies arrive on scene, they assess the situation, they check on the victims, they make the residents safe to enter, and they confirm the status of the call, and basically set up a perimeter around the residents. This initial phase, the cost of this initial phase is $120,000, and $229, sorry. From the initial response phase, we go to the investigative phase, which has been determined to be approximately $341,000. onto the follow-up investigative phase, which is amounted to $33,500, to the judicial phase, which is estimated to be $277,000. Now, this judicial phase is typically one or two detectives from each investigative unit that goes through the court process, the arraignment process, the preliminary hearing, the jury trial, so on and so forth. And then lastly, we have the incarceration phase, and we're basing this on, it basically includes any time the inmate spends time at the main jail. The cost is calculated using the daily jail rate, which was set at $173.50 a day. And this equated to $657,218 for a grand total of a single homicide investigation at $1,429,676. We talked about trends. Some of the trends that we're seeing beyond violence, there's the financial crippling of governmental resources, the creation of unsafe neighborhoods with coming and going of trafficking, the depletion of resource personnel management needed to investigate these incidents, and the environmental concerns. Kind of looking beyond the recent violence in the county, we have the recent incident of roughly 100 homes being seized in Northern California, and more than 500 law enforcement officers dedicated to working this investigation. The asset to purchase the homes that are being seized have been traced to a Chinese-based crime organization used to grow massive amounts of marijuana illegally, as reported in the Press Democrat on April 4th. This trend of criminal organization is occurring throughout the United States and abroad, as the product is leaving California and being delivered to the Midwest and the East Coast, and all points in between, not to mention what's being transported out of the country. And I'm going to end with just saying that, we need to continue to work to reduce the risk to our citizens, our visitors, and our businesses related to the cannabis, and diligently strive toward stringent regulations and enforcement. And I'll be happy to field any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sergeant, for that presentation as well. So that concludes our presentation phase tonight. And Kathy, do you want to have the council come up at this point, or do you want to do the voting exercise? What's your pleasure?
Let's just see if council has any questions first to the panelists, and then we'll open to public.
Great.
For questions, then we'll do the exercise and then public comment.
Good. Yes, please.
What is a marijuana-related crime? Is it people that are using marijuana, or are you talking about people that are producing it illegally, or is it both?
We consider, so a marijuana-related crime could be a domestic violence call. It could be a robbery. Anything that we investigate that stems from marijuana itself that has to do with that.
So like for the murders you talked about, were those produced, are there only one or two? But do you know, were those producers or were those users? Marijuana is not culturally known as a drug that is related to violence in general. It's not the reputation it has like alcohol. So I'm just wondering, are we talking about people that are producing it, which we're not going to plan to do in the town of Sonoma, or what are you talking about?
That would be both that are producing it and possessing it.
But do you know for the murders that you talked about, were those people that were using it recreationally, or was that
I can specifically talk about the 2016 homicide that occurred on Highway 116, where they were cultivators, farmers, that were robbed. Mm-hmm.
Can I speak to that a little bit? Just very quickly. And actually, I would just say to your comments, first of all, you were talking about very significant black market activity, and I would totally concur that everything you're talking about as it relates to increased enforcement ensuring environmental compliance, protecting public safety. I think those are all things a regulated industry is interested in. And I would also say, and I did hear Jeff talk about it earlier, part of the crime component related to cannabis is the excessive cash. And what the regulated industry fears is their biggest fear is being robbed because of the excessive cash. So what we're trying to do as a regulated industry is lobby for banking solutions, because I think that's where you see a significant crime element. If you are illegally cultivating, and first of all, we would never support cultivation or any sort of commercial cannabis activity in a residential neighborhood. I don't think there's any ordinance that would allow that, and nor would we support it as an industry. So I think the more we normalize the commercial side and treat it like a business, I think we'll have a better opportunity to address the crime and the black market activity, and that's just coming from the industry perspective.
And I would concur with that. I know that in 2017, there were 2 robberies of a dispensary in Santa Rosa, where a huge amount of cash was stolen. So I would agree with you with that.
Yes.
There's a switch.
We can hear you, Gary.
I don't know if they're taping this or not.
There you go.
So my question for you, Amy, is Senator McGuire brought up a number a while back on the cannabis business before anything was legal, was somewhere much higher than 8 billion or 7 billion that you mentioned.
In terms of revenue?
In terms of what the estimated number was, and it was somewhere around $40 billion in California.
I think there are varying estimates. What I'm talking about is the legal,
Right.
the actual legal industry.
So I just wanted to put that number out there. And one of my concerns is when we talk about with the county numbers coming back, with the resources coming back of such a small number on such a large number that's potentially out there. So I've worked in the dairy industry all the way up into Humboldt, and you know how that goes. So I guess my question is and going back to the homicide issues, and you know, there's homicides around money every single day in industries other than cannabis as well, and that's a big concern of mine. But how do we keep people from staying in the black market? And so if there's that $30 billion spread, let's say, that's my biggest concern is what's the incentive to go out and pay, as we do in our corporations, 50% tax? Why would you want to do that? So,
well, it's a very good question, and it's actually, I'll say something that the industry is grappling with right now, because really the elephant in the room is that there really aren't enough local jurisdictions that are authorizing. So a central component to the framework is local approval, and right now we're looking at about 30% of local jurisdictions authorizing some form of commercial cannabis activity. And the reason I mention that and the reason it's important is because if we were looking at let's say a 70 regulated 30 ratio, I think that the pain of meeting the very rigorous compliance standards and the testing requirements and the taxation, I think would be easier to bear as an industry. But right now, I will tell you the black market is actually more robust than it has ever been in this state, due to the fear, and for very good reason, that communities are having relative to regulating. So it is very difficult for a compliant operator to be compliant right now. We've been issuing licenses since January 1, and they are all struggling. And I will say this, every single one of my clients is either that is fully compliant is either laying people off or contemplating laying people off, because there is such an illicit black market. So again, I think the more, from our perspective, the more you regulate, as a local community, and the more you embrace the regulated industry, I think you're going to see a reduction in illicit black market activity because, too, you need to keep in mind that the more we raise in tax revenue, the more we can dedicate to eradicating those illicit operators that are not complying with the laws, that are operating without meeting the safety protocols and burying their cash and all of the concerns that have been raised relative to public safety. So, again, I think compliance is very difficult, and we as an industry are really grappling with that, which is really why we're doing so much work in terms of better educating and informing, because if we can balance that number out a little bit, I think there'll be more of an incentive. I'll just say one more thing. I spoke to a very young cannabis operator a year ago, and it was kind of an aha moment for me. He started as, a 20-year-old that thought it was cool to be a cannabis manufacturer, and then he had a child. And so he's willing to do all this now because it's sustainability. His doors won't get kicked in. He has some ability to, in following the law and being transparent and having law enforcement know who he is and the community know who he is, that provides added safety.
And the other thing I'd add is that there's a lot of work going into finding a banking solution at the state level and locally. I think that's potentially one of the big carrots out there that comes with regulation and legalization. If we can offer legitimate banking resources to the industry, I think that's going to bring a lot of people into the regulated environment. Mayor?
Yeah, Amy, welcome home.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask this question with respect to what you actually just said. It's a federal law, of course, and that creates this problem of the banking and the cash. So is that I can't see that changing soon, and I know that the industry, whomever, legal or illegal, actually have a funneling system to put money in, to funnel it in another way. And so I just don't know with the federal government balking at this issue, I don't know how far out you will be able to accomplish what you'd like to.
And I appreciate your comments, Mayor. The banking issue is probably the single biggest issue next to just meeting compliance requirements right now. There is a bill in the state legislature. We've talked about a banker's bank concept or a state bank. There is a bill that is moving through the legislature that is being authored by a very prominent member, a former Assembly Speaker, now Senator, that is gaining some traction. I think ultimately the solution is at the federal level. And what we're seeing is the industry, because it's becoming more mainstream, for lack of a better phrase, is really starting to make a lot of investments at the federal level. So they're hiring lobbyists and different advocates. And also as more states begin to legalize, we're really starting to mobilize our congressional delegation. So under the current administration, I think that many of us felt there was a setback, but at the same time, there is a lot more momentum as more states are regulating. So we are hopeful that we can enact a kind of a temporary state solution maybe this year. It's a huge priority in the Capitol, and then continue to mobilize and invest more resources at the federal level.
That sounds great. And my next question is for Tim. With respect, I'm so excited I can actually say Governor Lickenhooper's name from Colorado, and I think what he suggested is that California wait a little longer until they had some facts. So do they have you been part of a consortium of different states where you learn and don't have to reinvent the wheel from governors or legislators from other states?
We certainly reach out to other communities in Colorado, Washington, Oregon that have gone through this. But I do think... Sure.
Oh, sorry.
I would say we do reach out to the other communities that have legalized and cannabis industry. The thing about California that makes it so unique is the fact that we have such a long-standing industry here, and that the majority of cannabis in California is grown outdoors, which has created quite a few conflicts in unincorporated Sonoma County, whereas other communities, such as Colorado, they weren't a producing state prior to legalization, and still today the vast majority of the cannabis is grown indoors within that state. Sure.
All right, I have a few questions. You just remind me of one of mine. So I don't know who would be the best for this, but when I talk to people, a lot of people do bring up Washington and Colorado, and they hear a lot of bad things coming out of Colorado. So could anyone weigh in on the experience Colorado has had and what California, either that they're doing the same or that they're doing different, predictions of the future on that front? If there's anyone that could do that. If you can, I also have two other actual questions.
I'll try. Well, what I can tell you is that when we were developing the medical legislation and then also drafting the adult use framework, which is also referred to as the recreational model, we did look at Colorado, Oregon, Washington to try to learn from some of their mistakes. And one of the things I would note, and Tim just alluded to it, is these were much smaller markets, and they were less mature in terms of just the industry itself. I mean, we were 20 years before we actually developed a medicinal framework and started talking about state licensing. So there were some challenges with that because of just how mature this industry is and how significant this industry is. But a couple things I would note that I still deal with in the Capitol. One is Colorado, for instance, did not have any significant standards relative to child edibles. We have the most rigorous of any state in the union, and so that was a lesson learned. There were a lot of mistakes and challenges associated with testing standards in Oregon and Washington. So we kind of looked at that and were able to develop something that testing standards that we feel are more reasonable and appropriate. So we did look at the other states and some of those challenges and tried to use them in the development of our framework. So I think a lot of the things that I've heard about over the years, again, tend to be the holes and the gaps or maybe the places where they didn't get it right, and we took that very seriously.
A couple of other things that came to mind as well is packaging standards. Colorado didn't think that part of the process through initially, or labeling the product inside the package. And both of those, they came back later and amended their regulations. So now they have portion controls, packaging requirements, and a stamp on the actual product that labels it as a product containing THC. California already has those standards incorporated as well.
And I have a quick question for you, Mr. Meany Services. So after the last meeting, I think I was under the wrong impression because I know July 1st, there's going to be a shift and it's going to be more, you have to be on the recreational track or the medicinal track. But for dispensaries, can they still do both? Or do they have to pick one?
So Amy, you want to answer that one?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. And actually, that's a very interesting area that's being debated right now, so it could
Oh.
change. But I'll tell you, the current policy is between now and end of June, if you are a community that authorizes both adult use and medical, an adult user can acquire medicinal products. And the justification for that was there was no time when the packaging and labeling standards came out in November for the industry to repackage or even reformulate a lot of their products. So right now, consumers, adult use consumers, are really purchasing medical products that were largely manufactured in 2017. So that's one part of your question. The other thing I'll note is in communities that only authorize medical, you, as a adult user, you will not be able to go in and purchase products. So the local control component is really key here. So unless you are authorizing adult use at retail, and actually that's the present policy now. So if you're strictly a medical city like Santa Rosa, for instance, you can only you can only operate as a medicinal and acquire medicinal products. So it really just depends on what the locals are comfortable authorizing.
And so for there is the distinction, the products then? Because I've seen, because I know a lot of dispensaries in Santa Rosa at the end of last year, just to sort of put their foot in the door, went for recreational. So then I was confused as to whether that means they're transitioning and they won't be medical. And then if, say, we were medical, does that mean that everyone around us is going to recreational, or are they going to stay medical?
No, the product distinctions are actually written in the regulations, and they're not, really, the industry would argue that for the most part, it's the same product. The distinction is we will be required to put a medical label saying for medical use only. Now, the exception to that relates to edible products and other manufactured products. So for medical, there is a higher threshold in terms of the level of THC and serving size that you can acquire as a medical patient than as an adult user. But it's a very narrow, limited threshold.
Interesting.
And I think it's going to be possible to have 2 licenses,
Okay.
a medical
Got it.
and an adult
Correct.
use
The
license.
same building, but you can have 2
Separate the
licenses.
products,
If the city
account for
allowed
them
it.
separately.
Okay, all right, I only have 2 more questions. The next one, I'll just ask both of them. The first is, before banking reform, what practices are dispensaries using to keep their money safe? Because we had some tours, and I asked about this, and a lot of them have like multiple pickups per day. They were talking about like cash services, like someone else is taking all the cash, and I guess, I don't know, turning it over for them, I'm not sure. So I have a cash question, and the other is, as far as taxes go, I know the tax situation has been a little bumpy, and that there's things happening at the state level to either defer some of the taxes, or do we have any idea as to what the tax landscape is going to be looking like?
So maybe I can start with the cash handling aspect of things. And I think there are a number of different solutions out there being employed by the industry. Some of those, one of them you mentioned is a cash pickup or armored car type of service where they regularly have pickups that take the cash from the dispensary to a more secure and unidentified location for storage. They're also still working on banking solutions, and so some can deposit on a limited basis. And I think the third solution is these non-cash purchase instruments, like a debit card, a money order. There's all kinds of things that are out there that are being used or trying to be used as cash alternatives. Amy, anything you want to add from an industry perspective?
Well, first I want to clarify a misstatement I just made that Tim corrected me on for the record. Santa Rosa is apparently now authorizing adult use, so forgive me for that.
Yes.
That's what happens when you spend too much time in Sacramento. But in terms of, there's a couple things. There are members of industry. There are many that actually do have bank accounts, but oftentimes it's where they actually can find a bank that will bank them, and then where banks and sometimes they'll find a bank that will say we just don't want to accept excessive amounts of cash. So they will in areas and among industry where they can actually get checks, they'll deposit and use that for payroll and other purposes. So I just want to point that out. There are some that have limited bank accounts, though in most cases the turnover is very high. I can even tell you as the association, we had a credit union for years, and just a month ago they decided we don't want to deal with the word cannabis anymore, so they booted us out and we don't even touch the plant. So that's an ongoing challenge. In terms of, to Jeff's point, yes, there are armored cars, but also from a tax payment standpoint, the state has been investing considerable resources into helping to provide additional safety to cannabis operators. So legal cannabis operators they do coordinate with the state taxing entities right now. So when they are going to make their either their payroll payments or their excise tax payments right now, that's all made by appointment. There's CHP that are there on site. So there are some things that are happening as a result of regulation to provide greater protection as it relates to cash transport. I mean, there's whole different areas that we could talk about relative to taxes. You also asked about the tax debates in Sacramento. So again, we have a very, very small number of licenses that have been issued in the state, and those licensees are competing again with the crazy black market, and they are paying what we believe are now excessively high taxes because we've kind of constrained the industry because there's so few that regulate. So they're paying a 15% excise tax at the retail level, and that is on top of any a cultivation tax that is levied on what we call flower and leaves and stems. So it's that cultivation tax, then an excise tax, and then they apply the sales and use tax, and that excludes any local tax. So there is a lot of debate in Sacramento because right now on black markets you can buy a vape pen for $19, and on a regulated vape pen it's $45. So there's some legislation that's examining the taxation structure. All other states that have legalized at one time or another have adjusted their tax rates, and that could very well happen here in California.
I would just add at the county level, we were able to make adjustments in order to deal with the large amounts of cash, both from our permitting department and then our tax collection department. We do have armed guards out there for a small amount of time, a 2-week window when taxes are due, but we are collecting from well over 150 taxpayers. We also allow appointments and discreetly usher people into back rooms where we have the cash counters so they don't have to pay at the normal counter that you may pay to pay your property tax, which was due 2 days ago if you didn't pay.
Any other questions from the council? Okay, let's open it up to the audience then. Any questions from the audience? And if you just step up to the microphone so we can record the question, that'd be very helpful. And the council's welcome to join us here up in front at the table if you'd like at this point.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Tim and then a comment if you would indulge me. I'll make my comment I'll ask Tim his question first. When you showed your list of where you had people applied for permits, I could have sworn you had something on MacArthur Street?
Yeah, East
What
MacArthur.
is that?
Yeah, it's on East MacArthur Street. It's in the unincorporated area. Yeah, I have 1201 East MacArthur. It is a application for indoor cultivation.
Oh, okay. And then I have a comment. I believe that the legislature has completely botched the regulations that were intended to implement this proposition. And if you want to know why the black market is thriving and the legal market is struggling, it's because of the taxes. I have no problem with taxes. I absolutely believe that taxes are the price you pay to live in a civilized society. But you can't make them so high that people are going to say, you know what, the hell with you, I'm going to go to the black market. And that's exactly what the state has done. And I've read a couple of articles saying that two members of the assembly, a Democrat and a Republican that was in law enforcement for more than 25 years, are working on a proposal to lower the state tax. And that's what they need to do. And until that is done, this is not going to work. The state is killing the golden goose. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
This has been really, so I appreciate all that's been given. And a few comments I heard. I see there's lots of value in the regulation, and you mentioned Amy. And but one thing, and then as I was listening to the sergeant talking about the crime and everything, just the fact that a dispensary or a grower or whatever is legal and regulated, that's not going to, there'll still be a target for crime. So that piece is still there, I see. Secondly, the track and trace. My biggest concern about this, the adult use, it's not the medicinal, but the adult piece. When you have 21-year-olds or over getting the cannabis and giving it to youth, they could simply unpackage the material, and there'll be no way to trace how that material got to the youth. And with the THC levels being so high now, it's gone from 3% maybe when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and now they're up to 15 to 25%, even higher THC levels. And just all the side effects of marijuana are concerning, that it's just going to, about 100-yard proposed dispensary. I've talked to all my neighbors, have all really concerned about this location. And we're kind of baffled as to why are they, it seems like the state zoning, the buffer zone that's been talked about in the state is being completely ignored here, because the property is it's a firehouse. It's a small little commercial island in a sea of residential. It's surrounded by residential on all four sides. There's an apartment building to the east. There's a single family home that's literally on the property line to the north. There is no separation on there's so concerned about that particular project because I live near it, and those I've talked to are also very concerned about it.
So if I could, I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, I'm done.
I probably should have given more instruction before we started this
Okay.
process, so I'll do that as soon as you're finished.
I'm done. Thank you very much.
All right. So we'd like you to ask questions first and limit it to questions. We'll have a public comment period following the exercise that we're going to do with some of the buffer zone and mapping stuff. So if you could limit it to questions of the panelists or the council, that'd be great. And we're going to limit those to no more than 3 minutes. And I would like to see a 3-minute long question, but.
I won't take that long. Thank you. One of the things about the buffer zone, in our town, if St. Francis School, it's right across the pharmacy street from CVS. So I don't question, and I hope someone can talk to that. If someone who has a prescription can go get drugs there, why does it make a difference for that? Also, I want to be clear, my wife has never smoked marijuana, and I haven't smoked it for years.
And one more request, if you could also give us your name as you come up, that would be helpful as well.
Ben Sessions, been in Sonoma for 43 years, 5 years in Napa before that.
Thank you.
Good evening, all. Thomas Kennard, lifelong resident of Sonoma. Boy, what an eye-opener tonight. I see the format's changed on me already here. I have multiple comments about a couple of different things.
So we're limited to questions at the moment.
Well, we've changed that already. Now, the buffer zone is an absolute joke at 1,000 feet. If a criminal walks in to a cannabis club, that bullet goes a lot longer than that 1,000 feet. You need to seriously look at your 1,000-foot buffer zone. It's a problem. The other, it's become clear tonight that there's little difference between organized government and organized crime. You want to tax the farmer multiple times for the same square foot that he's already paying taxes on so he can grow this stuff. We've created a horrible problem here. I've lived in a neighborhood for several years. I've had a problem in the neighborhood I haven't been able to get government to do anything about. Nothing about. The question of criminals coming into my place to raid the neighbor's stinky grow site next door that I have to put up with the smell. I don't get to throw a little organic industrial sulfur over the fence into the air to kill his off. I get in trouble for that, but he can pollute my life for too many months a year. If criminals come into my property to raid his place and they come into my house, I become the criminal. You got some serious issues to think about here. There should be nothing grown in a residential zone. And this thing about wanting to use that firehouse in Glen Ellen for a facility is the most horrible idea. It's an incredible residential zone with hundreds of children around it all the time. So
thank you.
Please listen. Thank you.
So again, we're taking questions at this point.
We can just do it all.
Do it all? Do you want questions in? All right, we'll take questions and comments then. Name, and please state your name, and we'll limit you to 3 minutes.
23 years in Sonoma. I just want to Sorry, Kim Balchinas, 23 years in Sonoma. I'd just like to ask, we have a rental house, and the neighbor to the rental house is a marijuana grower. Our renters are having to put up with the smell. So how can you control that? That's my only question.
So currently, other than individual cultivation, which is permitted by state law and limited to 6 plants in an indoor location or an enclosed greenhouse, no cultivation is permitted within the city of Sonoma. So if you're within the city limits and you have a neighbor who is growing outdoors, you should contact the city for enforcement.
So let me just answer. So there was some confusion in 2017 in some interpretation in the ordinances. The council approved an updated moratorium in December of 2017 that clarified the personal growing of cannabis within the city limits. So that is now clear within the current moratorium that were updated in December, and staff is following up on any complaints related to issues that we would get since December 2017. So you can have grow 6 plants within the city limits, has to be inside or in a greenhouse. It cannot be in an open backyard. That's the current moratorium. We're actually bringing to council this next Monday an ordinance that will that will move that from a moratorium to a permanent ordinance for council consideration with those same parameters. So, and the council will consider that on Monday.
Okay. I think
I'll be very quick. City manager has answered my questions. I have been for 2 years adamant at trying to get this stopped within the city limits with nothing happening, but we're in some movement now. Thank you. Officer, thank you for your years of service to Sonoma County.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Okay. Yes, sir.
My name's Lenny Kleber, Sonoma High School graduate. Amy, love you, glad you're here. Whoever invited you, I want to give them a big hug. Thank you for coming. It's frustrating because a lot of people that are speaking are acting like there's no black market happening within the city limits. And it's been here for decades. And yesterday at the Board of Supervisors meeting, the Sheriff's Department made a stance that they don't see any difference in black market or legal market growing in the county. And, you know, Sergeant, those homicides, have there been any homicides on properties that are going through the application process? Or any?
I'm sorry, repeat your question.
Has there been any reports filed or homicides on operations that are going through the application process in the county?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, because a lot of this black market product, a lot of the reports are all black market product, and I don't know how many applications there are in the county, but there's probably over 100 of cultivation in unincorporated.
123.
Have there been any reports of break-ins on any of those?
Not to date.
Okay. My point is, going through the application process and trying to go legal, we're hopefully weeding out a lot of these situations where there's going to be break-ins and guns and violence. Video cameras, I would assume, are definitely going to be keeping a lot of these people away. 24-hour surveillance for up to 3 months. A lot of the efforts that we're going through, and I'm going through the application process in Sonoma County and up in Mendo, a lot of the the hurdles that I'm going through are going to prevent a lot of these people. And the same with dispensaries here in the city limits, manufacturers, testing facilities. I mean, I just really doubt there's going to be violence and guns drawn on these facilities within the city limits. There's so much black market situation going on within the city limits. And I mean, when was the last time a homicide happened within the city of Sonoma? And black market's been here for decades. So I just don't think regulating here in the city limits is going to bring violence. So anyways, thank you for your time. Thank you.
My name's Beth Donovan. I've been in Sonoma for 40 years. And you had I can't remember, I think it was you, had the graphic up there on the taxation of the plant. And you were taxing the leaves and the buds and the flowers and it was just, I mean, I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, do you guys tax vineyards like that? Like every time they bud, oh, we're going to collect taxes and go out and count. I mean, seriously.
So
It's a question. It's just, I mean, this whole valley is based on drug sales. It's alcohol, but it's a drug. And why, I just don't understand the taxation on the farming of this product.
So much of the tax structure was established by the initiative that was passed, Proposition 64. That's where the state excise taxes were enacted. That's that 15% excise tax and the tax on cultivation, the flower, leaf, and the recently harvested or fresh plant categories. State sales tax has been around up for a long time. That's the 7.25%. Granted, all of these are cumulatively a very high tax rate. That's something we've tried to consistently identify as a concern for the city and for the industry going forward.
May I make a comment?
Yes.
Just very quickly, and there was a previous speaker that alluded to this, and I should have raised it. So there is a bill. It's AB 3157. It is being authored by a Republican member of the legislature and co-authored by a number of Democrats. And that would eliminate the cultivation tax for 3 years, and it would reduce the excise tax from 15% to 11%. It is an uphill battle right now, but I think there is a very strong recognition that the taxation structure is very problematic for industry, particularly as we're competing with black market. So as I alluded earlier, I think you're going to see at least some attempts to significantly modify the state tax framework.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions. I'm Shauna Davis, and I live here in Sonoma. Is one, how do you define if someone is growing legally or illegally? Is there a phone number we can call in with an address for Sonoma County? Because we have 3 people growing a tremendous amount around us, and I'm just curious if they're licensed or not.
Sure. I will give you my card afterwards, and you can share those addresses with me, and I can look it up. Right now, there is not a bright line, as bright a line as we would like, because we are in this transition zone, but I can tell you whether that applicant has penalty relief, or if they've submitted a complete application, or if that parcel is even eligible to be permitted. Right. And based on that information, we can discuss the best way to deal with it, whether it's a code enforcement issue, et cetera.
Thank you. And my second is more of a comment. I hope that our city council looks for a solution to have a medicinal cannabis access for community members, for cancer patients, HIV/AIDS patients, or anyone with a chronic illness. I hope that you as a city council can come together as a team and look for a solution. So thank you.
Chris Petlock, Sonoma. So I know, I've said this before, I voted, and everybody I know voted for this proposition to take the crime out of this, take the cartels out of this, keep our kids safe. And I really feel like the overregulation is, as was stated earlier, is really kind of encouraging the black market and causing it to flourish. And I think just the opposite is going to happen. So I just want to know what are you going to do to protect our kids from this? Because regardless, it's happening here. It's happened here all of my life. Regardless of any of these regulations about not growing inside, it's going to continue to happen. My neighbors will grow. They'll grow in their closet. They'll grow in their backyard. They'll grow wherever. So the refusal to look at it, the refusal to regulate it properly, and to continue this ban or war on drugs or whatever that has not worked for 50, 60 years, it just feels like it's continuing on. So again, what are you doing to protect us from this?
Consider that rhetorical.
So I think that this is part of the process that the city council is undergoing now. That's why we're having the town hall meetings and the public outreach, is to hear these kinds of concerns from the public, along with representatives from the industry, the law enforcement community, to better understand what the county's regulations and framework look like, and learning from some of the problems that they're experiencing. And the one thing that I just want to clarify one more time is that outdoor cultivation is not permitted within the city limits of Sonoma. And many of the things that we're hearing about now in the way of concerns from the audience members and attendees here tonight are related to outdoor cultivation. And so we need to work through the enforcement piece of that, whether it's in the city or the county jurisdiction. Okay, additional comments or questions?
Outdoor cultivation and indoor cultivation still stink next to our house.
I just wanted to say I concur with many of the comments, and I won't reiterate things, but I just wanted to say, as a provider of over 10 years, the longest running licensed dispensary in the county and in Santa Rosa, I stepped into this industry because I was concerned about the safety of the medicine. When I was going through chemo 11 years ago, 12 years ago, I was pulling dog hair out of my black market cannabis, and I was outraged as a patient that I would have to go through that, and I got violently ill, and that I would have to go through that knowing as an herbalist that I wanted cannabis, a natural herbal medication for my illness, that I couldn't access that safely was enraging. And it was at that point I became an activist. And Sonoma Patient Group has tested for years, well beyond our competitors, because that was a priority to me. Safe access to medicine, especially when patients are coming to me with compromised immune systems. Safety of the medicine has always been a priority for us, and we welcome regulations even though it's hard. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Gil Latimer, and banks are more likely to get robbed than medical marijuana dispensaries. That's a quote from former Los Angeles Police Chief Charlie Beck. An analysis of robbery and burglary rates at medical dispensaries conducted by the Denver Police Department found that the robbery and burglary rates at dispensaries were lower than area banks and liquor stores. I don't think the data really supports dispensaries are more likely to be targeted at this point. That was Colorado Springs Sergeant Darren Ebink. In 2015, Metro State University in Denver reported no significant increase in crime trends after retail cannabis outlets began operating in January of the previous year, and were unable to establish a link between legal cannabis operations and particular types of criminal activity. In 2016, a study of 11 Western medical cannabis states published in the Journal of Drug Issues researchers found medical cannabis laws to have no negative effect on violent or property crime, and in fact, to be associated with significant drops in rates of violent crime. According to the City of Petaluma's staff report of November 6, 2017, law enforcement agencies in Lake, Marin, and Mendocino counties reported no definitive causal link between sanctioned cannabis-related businesses and increased violent or property crime. Crime rates in Sonoma County are generally down, vary city by city, and have no discernible connection to cannabis-related businesses. The Sonoma County Public Safety Consortium's Crime Analyst Group did not include cannabis-related crime in its top 5 priority projects list, which suggests cannabis-related crime has not been significant enough to merit special attention and tracking relative to other crimes. Crime in Santa Rosa, this is according to the staff report from Petaluma. Crime in Santa Rosa, where dispensaries and manufacturing of medical cannabis is permitted, is down in both the violent and property categories. Cotati currently allows 1 dispensary. The Cotati Police Department reports a negligible impact on calls for service or crime connected to the city's dispensary. Sebastopol currently allows 2 dispensaries and reports no violent crime directly related to the cannabis industry.
Thank you. Great timing.
Excuse me, I need some water. I'm Amber Rasucci. I'm with the 421 group, and I'm working with John Early, one of your local citizens. And I'd just like to thank you all for hosting this meeting and for having us here tonight. It's really exciting that the city is moving forward on regulations, and it's exciting that the citizens are working on a citizens initiative to pass regulations as well. This illustrates that everyone is working hard to make sure that we create some safe access to cannabis here in Sonoma. And it's important to keep pushing forward on both fronts because one way or another, we need regulations in Sonoma. To ensure success, it's critical that we find ways to work together, citizen advocates and policymakers. And I just really want to thank you all for facilitating this dialogue and for your time. So wonderful.
Okay, at this point, I think I'd like to invite David back up just to talk a little bit about the exercise with the maps and our buffer zones and any other questions you want to pose, David.
Thank you. Well, this is going to be the world's simplest exercise. Each of you is going to get, if you choose, 1 dot. That dot is going to be placed on the map with which you are most comfortable. So one map has, in essence, the minimum buffer zone requirement, which is the state mandated requirement of 600 feet around schools. The other map has options that address more extensive buffer zones that could be adopted at the local level. So that's the basic choice we would like you to make with the dots. And we will also be supplying Post-it notes and pens so that you can write additional comments for us to be placed on either map having to do with more specific ideas, recommendations, or suggestions that you have with respect to buffer zones and other zoning issues. So that's what we'd like to do, except as elaborated upon by the city manager.
Let me just add, since we're kind of wrapping up here, so after the exercise, we'll be done. So if folks want to do your exercise and then leave. So just to let you know, we will be coming back to the council in May for them to have a further discussion and deliberation. I'm not sure if that's going to take 1 meeting or 2 or the exact date. But if you want to, on the cards over there, if you want to leave an email address so we can add you to our distribution list, that would be great. And if you have further comments, you can send them into cityhall@sonomacity.org, and we'll get those and that way also. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, and have a safe drive home.
We are past the cross, but I don't know if I've actually ever met you, so.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So, thank you guys. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Oh, I don't know about that. I'm sorry. Just
No, it's really
on
good.
the fly, but let me know if there's any. Here, I'll give you my card.
Just fold, I'm under pressure, I'm a deer in the headlights.